The gig came up the last mile of the Rookhaven road at a walk, because the horse was tired, and because Elena Fenwick had asked the driver twice already to slow, and she sat with her satchel on her knees and a small carved wren pressed so hard into her palm that its chipped beak had begun to print a mark into her skin. She had told herself, 3 counties back, that she would not be afraid of a house, whatever its size, whatever the rook cut deep into the stone above its gate, and she had gone on telling herself that every mile since, which was itself a kind of proof that it had not worked. The road smelled of cut hay and horse, and underneath both, of the cold mineral breath of a river she could not yet see. The air had the particular held heat of a summer that had not rained in 3 weeks, and the hedgerows were white with dust to the height of a man's shoulder. She had 5 shillings sewn into the hem of her second-best dress, a letter of invitation she had read so many times the fold had gone soft as cloth, and her father's wren, worn smooth at the wing by 11 years of thumbs. He had carved it the winter he taught her to add a column twice, and check it a 3rd time before she trusted it, and he had called her his little wren for it, quiet and watchful, in a house full of rooks, though at the time she had not understood that Rookhaven was a place, and not only a joke he was making about his own house. Now she understood it very well. The gate arch rose out of the dust ahead of her, with a black bird already sitting on the stone rook carved into its keystone, as though the house kept a living ornament to match the dead one, and the gatekeeper who came out to meet the gig was an old man with a ledger of his own, a thin one, bound in oilcloth, in which he wrote the name of every cart and every soul that passed under his arch. Name and business, he said, not unkindly, the way a man says a thing he has said 10,000 times. Elena Fenwick, she told him. I've come about the invitation. He looked at her plain grey dress, and her one satchel, and the horse that was not a match for any of the other horses that had come up that road that week. And he wrote her name anyway, because it was his job to write names, and not to judge the cloth they arrived in, and that alone told her something about the kind of house this might be, or might have been once, before it went wrong. She did not yet know it had gone wrong. She would learn that slowly, the way she learned everything, by adding a column twice, and trusting it only on the 3rd pass. Nan Bellows sat across from her in the gig, 60 years old, and built like a good sturdy chair, and she had opinions about the whole business that she had not once in 4 days failed to share. A duke does not invite a girl with darned stockings to look her over for his son, unless he means to laugh at her, Nan said, and Elena had stopped arguing the point somewhere around the 2nd county, because there was no arguing with Nan when she had decided a thing, only outlasting her, which was itself a kind of family inheritance, since Elena's mother had outlasted worse than Nan for 20 years running. It is not for laughing at me, Elena said. It is because Aunt Prudence would not let it drop, and because the Duchess, who is dead, was her friend once, and because it costs the house nothing to feed one more girl for a fortnight. It will cost you something, Nan said. It always costs the girl something, and the house nothing. That is why they can afford to be generous with it. The wren went back into Elena's pocket, and she watched the black bird lift off the stone rook as the gig passed beneath the arch, unhurried, as though it had seen enough carts go by to know this one was not worth the trouble of staying for. She thought, without quite deciding to think it, that her father would have liked that bird, would have said something dry about a real rook not bothering to salute a false one, and the thought of him, 5 years gone now, sat in her chest the rest of the drive, like a stone-swallowed whole. The house itself came up gold and enormous out of its own shadow, windows catching the late sun in long orange bars, and she counted them out of habit, out of the same habit that had once made her father's ledgers the tidiest in the county, and she got to 40 before the gig stopped counting them for her by arriving. A footman took her satchel, with a face that gave away nothing at all, which she noted, filed, and did not yet understand, and led her through a hall floored in black and white stone toward a room where 4 other young women already sat over dishes of cold meat and bread, none of whom looked at her the way you look at a rival, and all of whom looked at her the way you look at a mistake someone else has made. Miss Fenwick, the housekeeper said, reading it off a card, and one of the 4, a fair girl with an easy, unguarded face, rose halfway from her chair before remembering herself and said, "You must be tired. Do sit. There is more bread than we can manage between the 4 of us," which was Cassandra Thorne, though Elowyn did not yet have the name to put to the kindness. She sat. She ate. She did not yet know that a door in the east wing of that house had a habit, once every generation or so, of standing open when it ought to have been locked, and that the old men of the estate called it, when they thought no one below them was listening, the Duke's threshold, and that it was not an accident at all, and that within the fortnight it would stand open for her. The room she was given looked out over the kitchen garden rather than the park, which she understood without being told was a small unspoken statement about where she ranked among the 5, and she did not resent it, because a girl who has slept in worse rooms than this one learns early not to spend her feeling on furniture. Nan unpacked the one trunk in less time than it took the fire to catch, and then stood at the window with her arms folded, looking down at the neat rows of cabbage and bean as though they had personally offended her. A house this size, and they've put a duchess's granddaughter's guest over the turnip beds, she said. It is not the turnip beds I mind, Elowyn said. It is being here at all, and being seen to be here, and the 4 of them downstairs knowing before I've said 10 words that I've no dowry worth the ink to write it, and the 5th of them, whichever one he is, knowing it before I've even walked into the room. She sat on the edge of the bed and turned the wren over in her fingers, running her thumb along the old scar where her father's knife had slipped once and never been sanded fully smooth, and Nan watched her do it with the particular patience of a woman who has watched a child grow into the habit of comfort and has long since stopped commenting on it. "Your father used to say a door left open is not an invitation," Nan said. "It is a question. He said it about that shop of his, the year before the trouble, when Vane's men came sniffing round with their lamps at all hours." "I remember," Elowyn said. "I remember it the way you remember a thing said in a doorway just before the house catches fire. Which is to say I did not understand it until years after it mattered." Nan came and sat beside her, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, which was itself its own kind of conversation, the sort 2 people can only have after 20 years in the same small rooms together. "Whatever this house wants of you," Nan said at last, "do not give it your shame. Give it your sums, your good sense, and that quiet way you have of watching a room before you speak in it. Keep the shame in your pocket with the wren. It has done its work already, teaching you to watch. It doesn't need to do any more." Elowyn almost laughed, because it was such a Nan thing to say, tart and true and delivered like a scolding, and the almost laugh was the first easy breath she had drawn since the gig had come up under the arch. Down in the yard a bell rang for the 2nd time that evening, calling the household to whatever came after supper, and through the window she could see, beyond the cabbage rows, a low grey building set apart from the main house, with a single narrow door studded in iron, no windows at all that she could find, and a man standing before it, turning a great ring of keys over in his hand, as though counting them the way she counted windows. And she watched him for a moment, without knowing that she was watching the beginning of everything. And then Nan called her down to supper, and she went, and did not think of the grey building again for 3 more days. It was the garden that undid her, or rather, it was a boy in a groom's shirt-sleeves, crouched over a broken cold frame with a piece of glass held up to the light, though she would learn within the hour that he was no groom at all. She had gone out before breakfast, because the house at dawn was still too full of strangers she did not know how to be around, and the garden, at least, asked nothing of her but to walk its gravel quietly, and she came around the yew hedge to find a man on his knees in the dirt, with his sleeves rolled and a smear of green along one forearm, muttering to himself about a hinge. He looked up when her shadow crossed the glass. "Mind the frame," he said, not unkindly. "There's a gap in the beading that lets the frost in come autumn. Though it's no business of anyone in a summer this dry to be thinking of autumn frost." She had assumed, from the sleeves and the dirt and the unhurried way he spoke to her, as though she were nobody in particular, that he worked for the house, and so she answered him the way she would have answered any groundsman plainly, with her hands behind her back. "Then mend it properly instead of squinting at it," she said. "A gap you can see is a gap you can measure, and a gap you can measure is a gap you can fix by supper." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not read, and something in his face rearranged itself, not offence, something closer to surprise, the way a man looks up when a coin he dropped rings differently on the floor than he expected. "You sound like you've mended a few frames yourself," he said. "I've kept a few ledgers," she said, "which comes to the same thing, only with numbers instead of glass." "Numbers don't cut your hands, though," he said, and held up his forearm with its thin green-edged scratch, and she almost smiled. And it was in that almost smile that the housekeeper came round the hedge, with 2 of the other candidates behind her, and stopped dead, and dropped into a curtsy so fast it looked like a flinch, my lord. "Forgive me. I did not know you were out," and Elena understood, a half-second too late to do anything gracious with the knowledge, that she had just told the Duke of Rookhaven's only son to mend his own broken cold frame like a hired man. He did not correct the housekeeper's curtsy, and he did not look away from Elena while she absorbed it, and there was something in that too, a small mercy, letting her have the moment without an audience's laughter attached to it. "I am Julian," he said, "since we appear to have skipped that part, and you have the advantage of me." "Elena Fenwick," she said, and watched his face for the flicker of recognition a name like hers sometimes still brought her in rooms old enough to remember her father, and did not find it, not yet. Only the plain interest of a man meeting a stranger who had spoken to him as though he were ordinary, which she understood, with the same quickness that had once made her father's columns balance on the first pass, that he was starved for. He rose, wiped his hand on his breeches rather than offer it dirty, and said something about the frost that would not come for months yet, and about frames that could be mended if a person only stopped admiring the crack in the glass and did something about it. And she thought, walking back to the house with the 2 candidates, who had gone very quiet and very watchful beside her, that she had been in this house not yet a full day, and had already said a truer thing to its air than either of the other 4 women had probably managed. In a week of practised smiles, and she did not know yet whether that was a good thing, or the first stone in a wall she would spend the rest of the fortnight walking into. The Duke received all 5 of them together that evening, in a long gallery hung with portraits of Rookhavens going back further than the paint could properly account for, and he was not what Elena had built in her head from the little Nan had told her on the road. Not a doddering old collector of daughters-in-law, but a spare. Upright man with a soldier's stillness, and a way of letting his silence do half his talking for him. He walked the length of the gallery once before he spoke to any of them directly, his hands behind his back, exactly as Eloin's had been in the garden that morning. And when he did speak it was to all 5 at once, which she understood at once was a kind of test in itself, seeing which of them could bear being addressed as a group rather than as 5 separate hopes. "I will not pretend to you what this fortnight is," he said. "My son will marry, and he will marry a woman I can trust to hold this house when I am no longer holding it myself. And I have found over the years that trust is not a thing a man can read off a settlement or a family tree, however finely either is drawn. I mean to watch you, all 5 of you, for a fortnight, doing nothing more dramatic than living under my roof, and at the end of it I will know something true about each of you that no letter of introduction could have told me." He said it plainly, without threat in his voice, and yet Elena felt the room's temperature drop a degree regardless, watched Cassandra Thorne's easy face go carefully neutral, watched a girl called Miss Dunmore reach for her fan though the evening was not especially warm. Vane stood at the Duke's shoulder through all of it, a neat, contained man of perhaps 50, with a smile that arrived at his mouth a full breath before it troubled his eyes at all, and when the Duke had finished he stepped forward smoothly to add the practical matters, which rooms, which hours, which doors were not to be wandered through after dark, in the manner of a man who enjoyed being the one to hand down the fine print after someone grander had delivered the sermon. Elena watched him read the names off his own list, and when he came to hers something in his face went still for half a heartbeat before the smile resumed its work, and he said Miss Fenwick with no more weight on it than any other name on the page, and yet she felt it land on her like a hand set flat against her back. Not a shove, only a pressure, only a man reminding himself, and perhaps reminding her, that he had not forgotten whose daughter she was. That night, in the little room over the kitchen garden, she told Nan about the stillness in Vane's face, and Nan's mouth went thin the way it did when she was deciding how much to say. "That is the man who sat at the table the week your father's shop was taken apart plank by plank," Nan said, and called it an audit, and smiled the whole time he did it. "I did not know his name was Vane. I only ever heard him called the Duke's man." "Well, now you have his name," Nan said, "and you'll want to keep it somewhere safe, the way you keep that bird in your pocket, because a name is a kind of ledger entry too, and you were always good at remembering which ones didn't balance." Vane found reasons, over the following days, to be present wherever Elena was set some small task, as though her name on his list had become an itch he meant to scratch by proximity rather than by any direct accusation. And it was in this way that she came to be given the cataloguing of the estate's old account books, ostensibly because Miss Fenwick has, I am told, a talent with figures. Delivered by Vane with a smile that suggested he considered it either a joke at her expense or a leash, she could not yet tell which. She took the task anyway, because a room full of old ledgers was, whatever else it was, a room she understood better than any drawing-room in the house, and because refusing it would have looked like fear. And Nan had told her to keep her shame in her pocket and give the house her sums, and this, if nothing else, was sums. It was Julian who found her there on the 4th evening, in a low room off the estate office, with dust standing in the last of the light like a held breath, her sleeves rolled the way his had been rolled in the garden, and he leaned in the doorway for a while before she noticed him, watching her run a finger down a column, the way another woman might have run a finger along a piano key, testing for the note that did not sound right. "You look at those the way my father looks at horses," he said, "whether they'll bear weight." She startled, and then did not apologize for startling, which she noted he seemed to appreciate. "Your father buried 3 of them under a man called Aldous Vane's stewardship," she said, before she had entirely decided to say it. And then, because she had already said the dangerous half of the sentence, she said the rest of it too. Mine was one of them. Julian came further into the room, slow, the way a man moves when he does not want to spook something small. "Fenwick," he said, as though turning the name over for the first time and finding a groove in it he recognised. "Thomas Fenwick. He kept the books here before I was old enough to know what books were for. I remember my mother liked him. I remember there was some trouble, and then there was no Mr. Fenwick, and I was 13, and no one explained a thing to a boy of 13 beyond there had been a shortfall and it had been dealt with. He was my father," she said. "He died 5 years ago, believing every soul in this county thought him a thief, and I have spent 5 years not correcting them, because I had no proof to correct them with, only a feeling in my own chest that a man who taught his daughter to check a column 3 times before trusting it was not a man who forged his own." Julian did not say anything for a moment, and the not saying anything had weight to it, the particular weight of a man discovering a debt he had not known he owed. "I am sorry," he said finally, and it cost him something to say it plainly like that. She could see it cost him, and she thought, not for the first time that week, that a man who could be made to pay a debt in that coin, in plain, unornamented apology rather than in charm, was a rarer thing in this house than she had expected to find. The moment held a beat too long, long enough that she saw him touch 2 fingers briefly to his breast pocket, an unconscious gesture, quickly checked. As though there were a paper folded there he was, in the habit of confirming was still where he had left it, and before she could wonder at it Vane's voice came pleasant and unhurried from the doorway. "My lord, your father wants you for the wine merchant." And the moment closed over like water over a dropped stone, and Julian went. And Elena sat a while longer, with her finger still resting on the column that did not sound right, though she could not yet have said why. It was 2 nights later that the discrepancy stopped being a feeling and became a fact she could point a finger at, in the oldest of the ledgers she had been given, the one dated the autumn her father left, where a column of expenditures against the wool clip did not balance by a sum too precise to be a copying error, and where, worse, the entries in the final quarter were written in a hand that mimicked her father's careful, upright letters closely enough to fool anyone who had not spent a childhood learning to write beside him at the same table. She knew his hand the way she knew her own face in a glass, the particular slant he gave his 7s, the way his ampersands looped back on themselves like a bird settling. And these ampersands did not loop quite the same way, not enough for a stranger to notice, enough for a daughter to feel it in her teeth. She sat very still for a long time, with the ledger open on her knees, and then she went and found Nan, who was mending stockings by the last of the candlelight, and put it in front of her without a word, and Nan looked at the page, and then at Elena's face, and set down her needle. "Well," Nan said, "there it is then, not a feeling any longer." "A thing that is gone asks nothing of you," Nan went on, quoting something Elena half remembered from her father's own mouth once, in a different context, about grief. "But a thing that is only buried waits. And this was never gone, child. It was only put somewhere dark and left to wait for someone with your eyes to come and dig it up. Where would the true one be?" Elena asked, "if this one is false. because a man does not forge an entry unless there is a true entry somewhere still to contradict him, and Nan, who had lived in this county longer than Vane had been alive, said, if it exists at all after 12 years. It will be where every account this house has ever kept, that mattered enough to lock away, has gone, which is the strongroom behind the kitchen garden, the low grey building with the iron door, and no one under the rank of steward has held a key to that room in living memory except on quarter day, when the Duke himself stands over the audit, and no one else so much as breathes near it. Elena thought of the man she had seen her first evening, turning his ring of keys over in his hand before that narrow door, and understood, with the particular cold clarity of a column finally balancing, that whatever proof existed of her father's innocence was sitting 20 yards from her window, behind an iron door she had no earthly right to open, and that the next quarter-day audit was 2 months off, long after the fortnight, and its verdict would be over and done. She went to Vane the following morning, because there was no other way into that room that did not run through him, and she went carefully, with the ledger under her arm and her voice pitched as level as she could manage, the way she had learned to hold her face still over a column that would not balance, so that no crooked stitch of feeling showed through the cloth of it. "Mr. Vane," she said, "I find an error in the wool accounts for the year my father left this house, and I wonder whether the original entries might still exist to be compared against it." Vane looked at her for a long moment across his tidy desk, and the smile came to his mouth the way it always did, a full breath ahead of anything in his eyes, and he folded his hands together with the patient courtesy of a man who has had this exact conversation, in one shape or another, many times before, with many different people, and always won it. "Miss Fenwick," he said, "I did not forge your father's shame, if that is what you are circling toward without quite landing on it. I inherited a shortfall he left behind him, and I spent a decade putting this estate back onto its feet, while the county whispered about a dead man instead of a living steward, which I confess I found convenient, though I did not arrange the convenience, only accepted it the way a man accepts weather. I am not cruel, Miss Fenwick. I am arithmetical, which the young always mistake for cruelty, because arithmetic does not care whose feelings it is correct in front of. She held his gaze and did not let her face show him what that speech had cost her to sit through. "Then you will have no objection to the original books being compared to the copies," she said, "since an honest sum survives comparison, and only a false one fears it." Something in his stillness sharpened for exactly the length of a held breath, and then relaxed again into courtesy. "The originals from that period are sealed with the rest of the quarterly stock in the strongroom," he said, "as I am sure your very capable nurse has already told you, since I understand very little happens in this house that does not reach her ears within the day. And the strongroom opens on quarter day, and not before, by his Grace's own rule, a rule I did not make and cannot break for the sake of a girl's grievance against a dead man's ledger, however much I might wish to oblige you." He said it kindly enough that a listener without her particular ear for false ampersands might have believed he meant it as regret rather than as a door closing with great courtesy in her face, and she left his office understanding two things with equal certainty: that the proof existed, and that she would never be handed a lawful key to reach it, which meant that whatever came next would have to come to her instead, uninvited, the way a debt comes due, whether or not the debtor has saved for it. It came 4 nights later, on an evening thick with the kind of heat that promises a storm and will not yet deliver one, when Elena woke past midnight to Peg, the youngest of the kitchen maids, standing at her door with a candle shaking very slightly in her hand. "Miss," Peg whispered, The strongroom doors stood open since supper, and Mr. Vane's gone to bed same as ever, and no one's thought to shut it. And I only tell you because you were kind to me over the linen the first week, and no one else in this house has been, and I don't know what it means, but I know it isn't nothing. Elena, dressed in the dark, with hands that did not shake nearly as much as she expected them to, and Nan, waking at the small sounds, sat up and said nothing at all, only watched her go, which was its own permission. The night outside was close and starless, the storm still gathering somewhere beyond the hills, and the grey building stood exactly as Peg had said, its iron door standing a hand's breadth ajar, a thread of lamplight leaking from within, as though someone had left it burning and forgotten, though she would learn much later that no one had forgotten anything at all. She stood before that door longer than she would afterward admit to anyone, because her father's voice was in her ear the whole time. A door left open is not an invitation, it is a question, and she understood, standing there with her heart going hard against her ribs, that the question this particular door was asking was not what will you take, but what will you become if no one is watching to stop you, and she found, with something like relief, that she already knew her answer to that one. Inside, the strongroom was smaller than its outside promised, close-shelved floor to ceiling with boxes and bound quarto ledgers, and it took her the better part of an hour by candle stub to find the year she wanted, and when she found it her hands went very still, the way they always went still over a true thing, and she read her father's own true hand, the real loop of his ampersands, the real slant of his sevens, setting down a wool account that balanced perfectly to the shilling, followed 3 pages later by a second entry in Vane's own disguised imitation of that same hand, backdated, inventing a shortfall that had never existed at all. She sat on the cold flagstones and read it through twice, and then a third time, because her father had taught her never to trust a column until the third pass, and on the third pass she wept. Not loudly, only the plain, unhurried tears of a debt finally, fully paid in the currency of proof, and when she had finished she did not take the ledger, though her hand went to it, though every reasonable voice in her head told her to carry it out under her arm that very night before the door could be shut on her again. She thought of the word thief, and what it would cost her father's name if hers were added to the same sentence, even in truth's service, and she thought of what her father had actually said, not an invitation, a question. And she understood that the honest answer to a question is not to run from the room with the evidence hidden in your coat, but to close the door properly behind you and bring the key to the one man in the house who had the right to ask why it had been open at all. So she rose and set the ledger back precisely where she had found it, marked with a torn thread of her own hymn so she would know the shelf again, and she went to the door and found the key still standing in its own lock on the outside, exactly as though someone had left it there on purpose for a hand less careful than hers to find, and she turned it and heard the tumbler's seat with a sound like a held breath finally let go, and she put the key in her pocket beside the wren, 2 small cold things riding together against her hip, and she was 3 steps from the kitchen garden hedge when Vane's voice came out of the dark. Not raised, worse for being level. "Miss Fenwick," he said, "you are a long way from your bed." She did not startle the second time either, though her heart did, and she turned to face him with the key's weight still warm from her own hand in her pocket, and the smile arrived on his mouth exactly as it always did, a full breath ahead of anything true in his eyes, though tonight, for the first time, she saw the eyes lag further behind than usual, as though the smile were working harder to cover something underneath it. "I might ask the same of you, sir," she said, "since it was your door standing open and not mine." He considered her for a long moment in the dark, and when he spoke again his voice had shed its courtesy down to something leaner. "Whatever you believe you found in that room," he said, "you will find it a very different matter to prove it belonged to you than to have merely seen it once by candlelight, and you will find the word of a steward of 30 years' standing weighs rather more in a magistrate's ledger than the word of a factor's daughter with a grudge and an invitation she did not earn. It is not my word against yours I mean to offer," she said. "It is the ledger's word against its own copy, and any hand that can read a column will see which one was written first and which one was written to bury it." Something moved behind his eyes then, quick and unguarded, the first true thing she had seen in his face since she had arrived in this house, not fear exactly. Closer to the recognition of a man watching a debt he had thought settled 12 years ago rise up out of its grave and ask, politely, to be paid. He did not lunge for her, not then. He was too careful a man for that. But his hand came up half a step too fast toward the pocket, where she had put the key. An instinct his composure caught, and reeled back in a heartbeat too late to hide that it had happened at all, and she stepped back out of his reach, without seeming to step back, the way her father had taught her to hold a column steady under a client's impatient eye. "Good night, Mr. Vane," she said, and left him standing at the hedge with the storm finally beginning to break somewhere out over the hills, the first fat drops striking the cabbage leaves like coins dropped one at a time onto a counter, and by the time she reached her own door she understood that she had not ended anything that night, only begun the part of it that would decide whether the truth or the lie reached the Duke's ear first, and that Vane, whatever else he was not a man who would wait quietly to lose that race. He did not wait. By breakfast the whole house had somehow acquired the story that Miss Fenwick had been discovered, in the small hours, creeping about the strongroom with a candle, and though no one said thief outright, the word sat under every glance at the table the way a stone sits under a thin cloth, visible in its shape however carefully it was covered. And Cassandra Thorne, to her lasting credit, was the only one of the 4 other candidates who looked at Elwyn across the toast and marmalade with anything other than careful, delighted distance, and said, plainly, in front of all of them, "I don't believe a word of it, and I should like to hear the true version from you when there are fewer ears about," which was itself a small act of courage in a house where courage cost a woman her chances. The Duke sent for Elena that same afternoon, alone, in a small study she had not yet been in, and he did not raise his voice, which she had begun to understand was worse than if he had. "I am told you were found near my strongroom past midnight," he said. "I would like to hear what you were doing there, before I decide what to make of what I am told." She could have lied. She understood, standing there, that a softer version existed, that she could say she had heard a noise and gone to investigate out of simple household loyalty, and that such a story would likely be believed, or believed enough, and would cost her nothing but a small private silence about her father that she had already carried 5 years and could carry a while longer. She thought of Nan's warning, "Keep your shame in your pocket," and understood that this was not shame she would be hiding but truth, and that the two were not the same coin at all, however much this house seemed determined to spend them as though they were. "I went to find proof that my father did not steal from this house 12 years ago," she said. "I found it. I did not take it, because I did not want the first true thing I gave you to be a theft, however honest its purpose. I locked the door myself when I left, and I have the key in my pocket now, and I have brought it to you rather than to anyone else, because you are the only man in this house with the right to ask me why it was open at all. She set the key on the desk between them, cold from her pocket, warm again already from her hand, and the Duke looked at it for a long time without touching it, the way a man looks at a hand of cards he has not yet decided whether to believe. "That door has stood open exactly 5 times in 5 nights, Miss Fenwick," he said at last. "Once for each of you. It is an old family habit, older than my father, and older than his, and I confess I am not proud of it, only convinced, after 30 years of watching it work, that it tells me something a settlement never could. 4 women found that door open, and did not go in at all, having been warned off it by the very rumour Vane makes such careful use of. You are the first in 3 generations to go in, find something that could have made your fortune by its theft, and lock the door behind you instead." He was quiet a moment, and something moved in his face that she had not yet seen there, something closer to the plain grief of an old man, realizing he had been wrong about a shape of person for longer than he cared to admit. "I owe your father an apology I cannot give him," he said. "I begin to think I owe you one instead." The apology, when it came in full, did not come easily or all at once, because the Duke was not a man who unmade 30 years of trusting his steward's face in a single afternoon, however plainly the key sat on his desk, and Vane, given the chance to answer for himself, answered smoothly, with the reasonable monster patience of a man who had survived worse accusations than a grieving daughter's. Certainty, insisting the ledger's discrepancy, could as easily be read the other way, that grief made poor arithmetic, that a girl who loved her father might see a forger's hand wherever she needed one to be. It was Julian who offered, that evening, the quiet ending that would have cost Elena nothing to accept, and everything to live inside afterward, coming to her in the corridor outside the room she had been given, his voice low, his hand at his breast pocket in the gesture she had noticed before, and not yet understood. "Leave it," he said. "Not the truth of it. I believe you. I have believed you since the night you told me my father's man buried 3 good stewards under him, and yours among them. But leave the fighting of it. My father will settle something on you privately, enough to clear your father's name in the county, without a public tearing down of a man who has run this estate competently for a decade, whatever else he has done. And you will not have to stand in a room and be doubted by people who have already decided what kind of girl creeps into strongrooms at night. It is kindly meant," she said, "and I do not doubt that it is kindly meant, but I did not come into this house to be quietly compensated for my father's ruin. I came, without meaning to be counted, properly, in the open, the way a column is counted, where anyone with eyes can check the sum themselves and find it true. If your father settles this in a back room, Vane keeps his position, and his smile and his half-breath delay, before his eyes catch up to his mouth, and somewhere in the county there is another Thomas Fenwick, another good man about to be quietly buried under a shortfall he never made, because no one this time was fool enough or brave enough to lock a door instead of running from it." Julian's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought she had wounded something in him that she had not meant to wound, and he said, more sharply than he had said anything to her yet, "Then perhaps it is better if you go home before this goes further, before my father is made to choose between his oldest servant and a guest of a fortnight, before I am made to choose at all." And it landed on her exactly as he had not meant it to land, as rejection rather than protection, and she went back into her room that night and told Nan she meant to leave in the morning, and Nan, uncharacteristically, said nothing at all to talk her out of it, only helped her fold the one dress she had unpacked. because Nan understood, better than Elena did in that hour, that some low points have to be sat in fully before a person can be trusted to climb back out of them honestly. She did not leave. The Duke sent word before her gig could be called that he wished the whole household gathered in the long gallery that evening, all 5 candidates, his son, his steward, and any servant with reason to have witnessed anything at all touching the strongroom in the past fortnight. And Elena understood, dressing for it with hands that had finally stopped shaking somewhere in the small hours of the night before, that whatever came next would not be settled quietly in anyone's back room. The gallery filled slowly under its long procession of painted Rookhavens, candlelight thick along the old gilt frames, and the Duke stood at the far end with 2 ledgers set side by side on a low table before him. The true one and its forged copy, fetched that afternoon by his own hand from the strongroom, with Eloin's torn thread still marking the shelf. He did not raise his voice to begin. 12 years ago, he said, this house lost a good steward and gained, in his place, a very capable one, and I did not think, in all that time, to ask what the difference between capable and honest might have cost the first man his life over. He asked Elena to read the true entry aloud, and she did, her voice steady, her father's own real hand laid bare under candlelight, for a room full of witnesses who could, if they chose, come forward afterward and compare the loop of every ampersand for themselves. And then he asked Vane to explain the second entry beside it, and it was here, watching Vane's composure hold for one long breath and then fail, that the room saw the thing Elena had glimpsed once already in the dark by the hedge, his hand moving a half-second too fast, this time toward the ledgers themselves, a lunge quickly checked, but not quickly enough, an instinct to snatch the false page away from comparison that told every witness in that gallery more plainly than any confession could have. He did not run. He was too old a hand at this particular game to run, and when he spoke at last it was without the smile at all, stripped down to something almost like relief, the relief of a man finally set down a weight he had carried politely for 12 years. I did what was asked of me, he said. Your father wanted a steward who could make the numbers behave, whatever the cost of making them behave. And I made them behave, and I have made this house solvent every year since, and if that required one dead man's name to carry a shortfall he never made, I confess I did not lose much sleep over the arithmetic of it. It was, in its own way, the truest thing he had said in the whole fortnight, and the Duke received it in silence, and then, quietly, without cruelty, told him to be gone from the estate by morning, and Vane bowed to the room with something that might almost have been respect for the girl who had beaten him, a worthy opponent's beau, and walked out under the painted Rookhavens without another word, and the room, released all at once from the held breath it had been keeping, began to empty around the 2 ledgers still lying open on the table. Julian found her afterward on the terrace, where the storm of some nights before had washed the whole sky down to a clean, rinsed dark, stars showing properly for the first time since she had arrived, and he did not begin with an apology, though one was owed. He began instead with the thing she had noticed him touch a dozen times without understanding, drawing a folded, much-handled paper from his breast pocket and holding it out to her with a hand that was not quite steady. I wrote this the year your father left, he said. I was 13, and I did not understand what had happened, only that a man I liked was gone, and everyone said thief in a voice that did not sound quite sure of itself, and I wrote him a letter saying I did not believe it, and I never sent it, because I was 13 and afraid of my own father, and I have carried it in one coat or another for 12 years, because I did not know what else to do with a thing I was too much a coward to send, and too ashamed to burn. She unfolded it in the starlight, and read a boy's uneven hand insisting, with all the fierce, useless loyalty of 13, that Mr. Fenwick was a good man, and everyone else was wrong, and she found, reading it, that she was crying again for the second time that week, though this time it did not feel like grief finally paid. It felt like something closer to being seen, entirely, all at once, by someone who had been carrying the proof of his own decency, folded small in a pocket for 12 years, without ever once producing it. "I told you to leave it," he said. "I am sorry. I have spent my whole life managing what I feel instead of saying it, because my father taught me that a duke's son does not have the luxury of plain speech, and I am beginning to think that is the exact lesson your father's ruin taught you to refuse, and I would rather be the sort of man who refuses it too. I will not soften my terms," she said, because she had decided, sitting with Nan through the worst of the low point, exactly what she meant to say if this moment ever came. "I will not be settled quietly on. I will not be a name in this house's ledgers that other people are permitted to doubt in whispers while smiling at me over breakfast. If I am to be your wife, I keep my father's name cleared in the open, publicly, in the county's own record, and I keep my hand in this estate's books, properly, not as an ornament who is humoured for her cleverness, but as a woman whose sums are trusted the way any steward's would be." Julian took the letter back from her gently, and instead of refolding it into his pocket, he tore it once, cleanly, and let the two halves fall from his open hand into the dark below the terrace, the way a man burns a debt he has finally paid in full. "Then let us write a new one," he said, "one we actually send." And she found, standing there with the stars coming out properly at last over Rookhaven, that she did not need to answer that in words at all. A year on, the gig came up the Rookhaven road again, though this time it was her own carriage, and the hedgerows were green rather than white with drought dust, because the rains that year had come in their season the way rains are supposed to, and the same old gatekeeper came out with the same thin oilcloth ledger to write down the name of whoever passed beneath his arch, and the same black bird, or one very like it, sat on the stone rook above the gate as though it had never once considered leaving its post. "Name and business, my lady," the gatekeeper said, because he had learned, over the past year, to say the words with a small private smile of his own, and she leaned from the carriage window, with the wren still riding in her pocket, where it had ridden 100 miles that first summer, though now a second small carving sat beside it, a rook no bigger than a thumbnail, chipped in one wing to match her own, carved for her by Julian's own unpractised hand as a wedding gift, because he had said a wren ought not have to sit alone in a house so full of rooks. "Elena Rookhaven," she told the gatekeeper. "I've come home." The carriage went on beneath the arch, past the low grey building behind the kitchen garden, its iron door standing open now on ordinary hinges in ordinary daylight. The key hung on a plain hook beside it, where any steward with lawful business might take it down. Because a door that has nothing left to hide has no more need of being asked its question in the dark. And past the study window where an old duke, greyer now and slower on his feet but steadier in his face than she had ever seen him, raised a hand to her without rising from his chair, and up to the house itself, where Julian stood on the same terrace under a sky, gone the deep green gold of a good harvest evening, and where, tucked into the crook of his arm, wrapped against the evening air, was a child not yet 3 months old, who had already, in the manner of very small children, developed the unfair habit of falling silent and watchful the instant a room grew too loud around her, so that Nan, who had never in her life let a good line pass unspoken, had taken to calling her, with a tartness that did not entirely hide the tenderness underneath it, their second wren. If this house has felt like your own fireside for the last hour, stay a little longer before you let the lamp gutter out, because it is stories like Eloin's, honest doors and locked ones, that I love telling most, and if the moment she set that key down on the Duke's desk stayed with you the way it stayed with me, you might tell me so, and while you are there, consider staying on at Stewardship channel _name Nakey H. So the next tale finds you when it is ready. The kettle is already on for it, another story sitting close to the fire waiting its turn to be told. So until then, sleep gently, and be kind to whatever quiet, watchful thing you are carrying in your own pocket.